Welcome to the Clearing the Air podcast. My name is Amy. Clearing the Air is a branch of Rethinking Climate and opens conversations about complex and overlooked climate issues to make them more personal and accessible. We trust experts from a global network to bring different perspectives to our learning journey to show that there is a space for everyone in the climate movement. So welcome to the Clearing the Air podcast. This is Helen Moffett, who is a writer, a poet, and an editor who, among other literary endeavors, has written 2 books around sustainable living. 101 Water-Wise Ways and Wise About Waste are the first 2 in a series about sustainability. She also writes a blog about reducing waste, and her house is off-grid when it comes to water. I'm very grateful to have Helen here to talk today.
Hello, Amy. Hello, everybody. And we've been having such a nice chat already. I'm just going to cover a little bit of ground of what we've been chatting about, talking about the importance of individual efforts. And you and I, you made the very valuable point that there's almost nothing more individual and personal than what we choose to eat, or even how and where we eat, and how, every single one of those decisions is a chain reaction that leads to further choices and impacts and effects. And I suppose that's the reason that's encouraging, is because looking at the state of the globe today and looking at how terribly, horribly we have gotten everything wrong. Certainly since the end of World War II, in terms of the way we generate industry, we grow the economy, which itself is an absolute minefield. But we've made so many rotten choices. It's so clear that the biggest polluters are big businesses or corporations, aided and abetted by governments who themselves are often major polluters. So then the question arises, well, why should I recycle plastic? Or why should I drink only fair traded coffee? And I was telling you about the time I was interviewed by a breakfast show host in Gauteng who said, what is the point? As we speak, huge corporations, huge industries are pumping sulfur dioxide into the air that we're breathing, metric tons of it. What is the point? And I said to him, the thing about our individual choices is that they model decent ethical behavior to our children. And, it's something that I say a lot, that we are going, my generation, and I suppose the boomers just ahead of me. I look very boomerish at the moment. I've got COVID hair. I finally decided to let my grey hair grow out.
I'm loving the grey hair.
I'm thinking, why didn't I do this years ago? Anyway, the boomer generation and my generation are going to be the most hated generations in the world, because we have really, really left the most appalling mess for our children and our grandchildren to mop up. And we have literally, the choices we have made will impact your quality of life and your children's quality of life for decades, if not centuries to come. That's even if we all survive. One day, I live in terror that one day we're going to wake up and the air is just not going to be breathable, or the ocean is no longer going to be a viable or sustainable place, and it will be all our fault. And
when we realize it is too late, actually.
Yeah. So given these terrifying realities, this guy was saying to me, what is the point? And I was saying that at least our children and our grandchildren were going to be able to say, sure, this generation really screwed up the planet, screwed up our future, screwed up our lives. But at least they saw the error of their ways and they tried. They composted, they recycled, they switched off their electric geysers, they switched off their pool pumps. They stopped treating a middle-class lifestyle as some sort of pristine god on an altar that had to be worshipped and serviced at all times. And increasingly, and I mean, this is something you and I were chatting about, things that 30 years ago were not considered ethical choices, like what car you drove, where you went on holiday, who you voted for politically. These were considered personal decisions that other people were not allowed to interfere with. If you wanted to drive, a massive, great big 4x4 tractor to and from the shopping mall, sort of a round trip of 3 whole kilometers on smooth, hard roads, that was your choice. You couldn't say to somebody that's morally wrong, even though it is morally wrong. Who you voted for politically used to be personal. This wasn't something that you could attack somebody for, or you could have a political debate with them. You could have a political argument with them. I mean, you just have to switch on any form of social media to see that, people going at it hammer and tongs. But it's always been considered a left versus right political argument. No, actually, those are now moral choices.
Yeah.
If you're voting for somebody who thinks that stripping the Amazon of its indigenous forests, hello, those are the lungs of the world, take out, and there's a very real possibility our children will have no air to breathe. That's no longer a political choice. That is now a moral choice. And I'm not even going to speak about what goes on in America, and I'm not even going to speak about what goes on here. But the bottom line is that it is now we are starting to realize too late that things that we have only ever seen as individual choices, that we've got a right to decide that we're flying off to Europe on a skiing holiday, that we have a right to eat aged Kobe beef in a restaurant. All of these actually have moral ramifications. And I have found something so interesting is that the way I respond to culture around me now is increasingly determined by choices that characters and individuals make. I'll give you the tiniest, silliest little example. I was reading a book by the author Joanna Trollope, just a light little COVID recovery read. For those who don't know, I have long haul COVID, and sort of it's been 6 months and I still haven't recovered. And one of the things that happened was that I couldn't read. So I've been reading light stuff. So here I am reading this light book set in Spain. And a character we're supposed to identify with takes the supper, the homemade supper his partner has left him. And as an act of rebellion against their marriage, he tips it into the waste bin. And I was like, right, I'm not interested in you anymore. Lost me as a character. That's food waste. I don't care about the passive aggression towards your wife. All I can think of is that there are hungry people on the streets and you just tipped food into a garbage bin. And I realized that I had clearly made some sort of profound moral shift.
Yeah.
And I think that is increasingly going to determine our future. That, sort of who we, for example, have sex with, which was a burning issue 20 or even 30 years ago, is irrelevant compared with what we drive, what we consume, what we eat, and whether or not we're standing around whether we're running sprinklers of drinking water onto our lawns. And the other thing, of course, and I think this is relevant for anybody who's got Wi-Fi and who's listening to this podcast, is that it's middle-class lifestyles that are the problem.
I was going to bring that up, of that personal freedom implies such a privilege that you're able to make that choice, that you think it only affects you. But the thing is, the biggest effect is on those people who don't have the same agency and who don't have the same opportunities. And people living in poverty will be the first to feel those effects.
Well, they already are. There are cities in Southeast Asia that are practically floating out to sea. This is the glaciers melt. Anyway, the other thing, of course, is that there's a tremendous temptation to blame the poor for environmental issues. You remember at the start of the water crisis, all of that muttering about washing of taxis and townships and standpipes, that were broken and that where the taps were broken and they ran all day. And I'm like, hello, you've got to stand in a queue with buckets at a standpipe for your water. And you're complaining about the fact that those tap washers are broken. Whereas you've got 24 taps and 3 bathrooms inside your home. You know, I know which is more wasteful. And then, of course, there was that UCT academic who worked out that in 3 square miles of the southern suburbs in Cape Town, there was enough water in the pools to wash 80,000 taxis. And everybody shut up about taxi washing after that. But I mean, there are other problems. I mean, waste disposal is a huge problem in informal settlements because there's no nice garbage pickup.
Absolutely.
Structural elements like access for garbage trucks, please, just rubbish bins. These are huge challenges. And an enormous amount of plastic waste comes from some of the poorest cities in the world. But it's not because people are making poor choices.
Not at all.
They have no choices.
Yeah.
So the whole way we even think about waste management, which is that we have organized waste management so that it works very, very well for the middle classes. You know, pay their rates and the trucks show up and people are employed and they empty our dustbins and we can recycle. I mean, I recycle, as you know, to a ridiculous degree. I'm terribly proud of the fact that I generate between 5 and 6 kilograms of solid waste a year.
A year, that is incredible.
Well, it sounds great, but the awful truth is I couldn't do that if I didn't have a car. So that means I take bag upon bag upon bag of bottles and cans and plastics and recyclable plastics and paper off to recycling centers, or I put them out for other, emission producing vehicles to come and pick up and take away to be recycled. And then also sort of, it sounds so very virtuous, but I look at the plastic that goes off that I send off to the recycling, and twice a year I've got a huge, great big sack. It is nearly as tall as I am, and twice a year I fill it up almost to the brim and take it off. And I think I try to buy as much nude food. I try to reuse and recycle my plastics. When my water bottles get so niffy and scratchy that I can no longer keep them sterile and clean, they become tree planting containers, and I saw off the tops and I use them as kind of homemade cloches, and I put them over seedlings in the garden to protect them from snails. So, at any given moment, my backyard is a bit of a mess, but I try to reuse plastic as much as possible. I had a wedding here 3 years ago in my home, in the garden of my home, and it was beautifully catered, and the food came in these gorgeous little sort of reusable tubs with lids. I'm still using them all, and I still generate 2 head-height sacks of plastic a year. And I can do that. I have that luxury because I have a car. I have a car for shopping. I have a car for bringing it in, so I can drive to the low impact deli with a car full of bags, jars, paper packets. I have the luxury now of getting shampoo and dishwashing liquid and that sort of thing from these huge containers at the low impact living store that I then decant into my glass bottles. Now, can you imagine if I then had to get home in a taxi?
And any form of public transport, it would make it impossible. Absolutely.
And I mean, it's part of why I think we've gotten so wrong about everything. I always see these special on in the supermarkets. And I went into Pick and Pay for the first time in months the other day. And I was so interested to see the way they've swiveled towards marketing cheap food for people who are clearly cash strapped. As you walk in, there are huge displays of sacks of maize meal, bags of potatoes, bags of butternut. And I think, how do you get these home if you don't have a car?
Yeah.
How are you supposed to wrangle a 20-kilogram bag of maize meal on a taxi? Yes, it's what you need. You realize everything about the way we feed ourselves, about the way we distribute food, is just wrong. But I think this pandemic has taught us that an awful lot of the choices we make and of the way we live is wrong. There are some truths. It's been like a one of those terrifying mirrors that shows you the truth, or perhaps the emperor's new clothes. For example, I don't think you are ever going to get the middle classes, I hope, back into their cars and into rush hour traffic.
Yeah.
Sure, some people don't have the luxury of working from home. There's no space, there's no privacy, they don't have decent Wi-Fi, they don't have decent connectivity.
Generally, their lifestyles are already the less impactful ones in terms of greenhouse gas emissions.
But to kind of pick a few silver linings out of this pandemic, although some people don't consider this a silver lining, I do. There are businesses that are closing up their corporate headquarters for good and telling their staff, you are going to work from home forever. In other words, you can now go and live wherever you like. That's got a decent Wi-Fi connection. If we do need face-to-face now and again, we'll rent a conference room in a hotel. We'll temporarily hot desk. Basically, we've realized that if people are left at home to work, they're not going to skive off. There's this whole thing of trust that, if we're left alone at home, we're going to, I don't know what we're going to be doing. Watching daytime movies, I haven't a clue.
And hopefully put more emphasis on those shared spaces as well. And hopefully people will enjoy coming together more and realize the importance of that connection as well.
And then also, there are all sorts of things like, we're going to be asking questions. Is this meeting really necessary? Or can we deal with this simply with a few reply or emails? But hopefully you will never get us back into rush hour traffic. We need to make, this is real pie in the sky, but I'm hoping, I had so many hopes and prayers when the pandemic started. I thought, at last, we're going to pay teachers and healthcare professionals, healthcare workers properly and protect them. We're going to value childcare. We're going to understand what it really involves. We're going to give huge tax benefits to childcare expenses, or we're going to provide subsidized childcare. We're going to acknowledge how incredibly important this is. In the home, in the family, we're going to realize how important it is to share domestic chores and parenting, regardless of who is bringing in the paid income. Because without the unpaid labor that's going on, mostly performed by women, we wouldn't be able, the earning partner would not be able to earn. If they had two toddlers screaming around all day long and they were responsible for them as opposed to handing them over to somebody else, and they had to sort of feed those children and keep them clean as well as entertained and educated, nobody would get any work done. So I thought that I thought this would lead to kind of like a revolution in domestic and intimate care in the home. I roll. I think we've all learned an awful lot about how dreadfully we have been behaving for the past 50 years. But one of the things that I thought that we would also see the wisdom of is the importance of decent, safe, reliable, cheap, subsidized public transport. Because there are people who have to go to work. There's no choice. Think of, we now have a completely new appreciation of shelf stockers, till packers, all of the people who make our everyday life comfortable. People who work in factories, people who have absolutely no choice but to go to work, to put themselves at risk in a pandemic every single day, who have to get into unsafe, crowded taxis. We should now be investing. We can take most of the cars off the road. The middle classes do not need to drive to work. They can stay home in their home offices, and you go in once a week or once a month to some communal place that's, as you say, really fun to be in. And the people who have no choice but to go to commute to work day in, day out deserve and need safe, decent, cheap public transport. So we could seize this pandemic as an opportunity to make all sorts of lifestyle choices that are sustainable. And if we don't, I mean, personally, I think we're going to see more of this. It was SARS, it was MERS, now it's COVID. Now, I'm great in that I can't infect anybody, and temporarily, we don't know how long it's going to last. I've got to have regular antibody tests. But in theory, I can't be infected again. Yeah. Unless, says my infectious diseases specialist sort of optimistically, this bug mutates.
Which is very likely or very possible.
And I still look at the impact on the globe, and I think maybe this is Mother Nature's revenge. The last time I ever flew internationally, and I mean, this is where I say sort of like, nobody needs to look up to me as a role model. I actually flew to the UK to see my British publisher and to do some research and to take part in a writing retreat. And the point is that I got on a plane, came home and immediately planted a whole lot of trees, but I still got on a plane.
Yeah.
And I was flying via Dubai with Emirates, and the plane touched down. Amy, I'm not joking. It taxied for 40 minutes to get to its berth. Not round and round in circles. That's how huge the airport was. And we were just going past these rows of hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of parked planes. I these planes just standing there waiting to sort of like hop into the air, and I thought, the planet doesn't stand a chance. And I thought, what would it take to shut this lot down? Well,
and then the coronavirus.
4 months later, the skies were empty. Yeah. And I don't know if they'll ever be quite the same ever again. And, 4 months later, the skies were empty. 4 months later, there were all of those shots of the Himalayas seen from Kathmandu without smog haze. So we may have no choice. The natural environment may actually just twist our arms up behind our backs and frog march us into a new way of being. So that's what I wanted to say to you and to your listeners about individual choices.
I think another important thing is how, I think you've touched on it a lot, but that these more sustainable choices are generally the less luxurious, middle class, comfortable choices in our lifestyles. And it's an important thing of how do you get people to choose the less comfortable? And you've mentioned that it's really an ethical and a moral choice more than any lifestyle choice.
Yeah, go back to sex. If you're in a monogamous relationship and you've both agreed to be monogamous, and you meet a gorgeous hottie in a bar, you can't just give in to your impulse. Or if you do, it is generally acknowledged and recognized that you are doing something potentially hurtful and morally wrong. It's the same thing here, sort of now, sort of the way we negotiate relationships is completely different. You might agree to be in a polyamorous relationship, or you might be going through a system of serial monogamy that works for you. I think now people are much more upfront about those choices and how they manage those impulses. Do you have another drink before you get behind the wheel of a car and drive home? It's accepted that there are certain social rules that need to be followed and that are even sometimes policed by law. But this is different. This is now, I think, increasingly there's a recognition that, as I said, things that we used to consider private choices and luxurious choices, spoil yourself, self-care, are actually moral choices. But one thing I wanted to say is that, we think about we think that these choices are luxurious, etc. We think that they're easier. Yes, we are addicted to our individual rights and to convenience, but we're losing out on an enormous amount of pleasure in the process. A lot of the choices that I do not enjoy lugging buckets every time I want to wash my clothes. But some things like one thing I've loved about the pandemic is that I've always made a lot of my own food from scratch, but I've made even more of it from scratch. And there's a tremendous pleasure in that. And then also you start cooking in bulk. you get a glut of apples, you've got the pot on or the oven on anyway, you might as well make sort of half a dozen jars of apple chutney, but then you get to give them away to the neighbors, and then the neighbors remember to sort of give you something. And I mean, you know this from your mom's veg garden and also from talking to me, the amount of pleasure I get out of regrowing my beetroot tops and my leek bottoms is enormous, that it's not all about grim austerity. It's sort of making your own moisturizer and makeup at home, making my own, I soak lavender and lemon geranium leaves in white spirit vinegar to make a cleanser for my home. That's enormously satisfying. Giving stuff away, getting rid of the possessions with which we clog ourselves. We're told that we can kind of get our dopamine hits and we can comfort ourselves by going out and shopping till we drop. And yes, we all know we get that little bit of a rush. But you know that terrible empty feeling when you get home and you thought, I really didn't need that blouse that I just bought half price at Woolies. And actually, I don't even like it that much.
Yeah.
Whereas you get a similar dopamine rush by going through your clothes and giving them away and taking them down to the vintage store or to the thrift store. I get the most tremendous dopamine hits out of secondhand books in secondhand bookshops. So a lot of these choices are pleasurable. They create strong community networks. I would have been toast in this pandemic without my neighbors on both sides, because we forget that under hard lockdown was when I needed food and medication the most. And everyone said, deliver. Well, I remember that there wasn't a single pharmacy that didn't have a 3-day backlog. And I couldn't breathe. I needed the drugs, in the next 5 minutes. There was nothing that could be done. My neighbor risked his life charging down to Dischem to get me my steroids I needed to nebulize to keep on breathing. But, you rang up Pick and Pay, all these places. Sorry, we don't even have a delivery slot in the next week. So my neighbors bought me food, and friends sort of who were already out and about. But, we forget we weren't allowed out unless we had an essential services permit. We were carrying our prescription with us. So a few people ran the gauntlet. There were roadblocks. I knew people who got thrown into jail for going shopping. So, and there I was sort of like too sick to get out of bed and living alone. And I would have been history.
Yeah.
My neighbors were prepared to drive to meet people who were carrying groceries for me. They were prepared to get my medication for me. Until things got up and running, I would have been history without them. And I think that is how a lot of communities, especially poorer communities, know this already.
Yeah.
They can't manage without a neighbor, when they run out of food towards the end of the month, or who will loan them, or give them 5 liters of water when, the boreholes in the Eastern Cape all dry up. So there's a lot of joy and there's a lot of goodwill and there's a lot of pleasure to be had in making those choices as well. And I think that's important.
Yeah.
We were sold on the myth. It's one of the lingering perceptions of the Cold War, which is what we grew up on, was that that socialism meant grey, grim, faceless apartment blocks with broken elevators and long queues for 3.5 loaves of bread in stores. And it's not like that. You can go to markets, you can sign on for the community exchange program, which I absolutely love. You can join Facebook and online groups that do barter. You can go and help at a soup kitchen. All of these things are good for you and they're good for the planet.
I think a lot of it comes down to empathy.
Yes,
and
that's a very good point.
I think the empathy has to come almost in order to change those habits.
And we live in a culture that has kind of almost surgically removed our empathic instincts. It's no longer drummed into us via religious structures or structures like Girl Guides. Schools have become hotbeds of bullying and narcissism, and mean girls type cliques and jock type cliques. all of the places that we used to get moral or training, and that's what you're actually talking about. Empathy is the ability to imagine yourself in somebody else's position. And it's life-changing. I had a relative who, when she was a little girl, often used to send food home in restaurants. And one day I said to her, and the poor server would always say, "Would you like a doggy bag?" And she'd say no. And she was quite young. And I remember saying to her, imagine how that person who cooked that meal for you feels having to go and scrape it into the bin when she's got hungry children at home. And the expression on my relative's face, it had never, ever occurred to her to think about the impact of that small choice she was making emotionally on the person who was providing her with service.
Yeah.
And the thing that really got her was not just that this person who'd taken trouble to make her a perfect meal was now having to scrape it into the compost or the pig bucket, but that she would have to go home with maybe a few stale leftover rolls to children. And it stopped that habit. Boom. She still often leaves food on her plate, but she always takes it home in a doggy bag. Yeah. And it's a matter of pointing. People are not intrinsically bad. It's simply that they lack imagination, which is why I'm such a great fan of the arts and of culture.
Yeah.
It's why I insist that reading is one of the things that will save the planet, because reading is a secular, recreational, safe way of standing in somebody else's shoes and looking out at the world through their eyes.
Absolutely.
I managed to get a plug for reading in.
Definitely. I wanted to get that in as well.
Excellent.
I think it's important to show that climate change is entirely a human issue as well. People think it's this distant thing with nature, but it's only about us surviving in this climate. And I think those small moments of empathy are really important in showing why we need to fight against climate change.
As you say, empathy will lead us home. And also, as I said in the Waste book, an environment, we've taught to think of it as something distant and a luxury and something that belongs to game lodges and rich tourists or holidays. Actually, I'm in an environment right now that enables me to breathe and remain hydrated and will feed me and shelter me. And all of those things are infinitely, well, they're not even just precious. They are life-sustaining, and they're all under threat because of our growth at any cost mantra. Okay, shall we wrap it up for today?
Yeah, I think that's our time. But thank you so much for the conversation.
Yeah, really enjoyed this question of individual choices.
You are listening to the Clearing the Air podcast. I am Amy, and you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter. Please don't forget to click the like button and subscribe to the channel.